Hello, my name is Alex, and welcome to Eclectic Eccentrics, a series in which we will be looking at some marvellous and some not so marvellous individuals who have been described as eccentric somewhere along the way. Their stories might delight, terrify, or intrigue you, but they will always entertain. Oh, the grand old Duke of York, he had 10,000 men, he marched them up to the top of the hill and he marched them down again. Things have warmed up, and we are at full speed, for we are quickly approaching the end of Series 3. Don't fret though, 2 more episodes to go, and I have a real treat for you today. Now, we've certainly met some interesting characters as we've weaved and wormed our way through this series, but today we are meeting a chap who has been described as Britain's most eccentric man. What an honour. You are indeed standing in this glorious eccentricity, for in this episode we are looking at none other than the man himself, Lyndon Yorke. Now, I usually start off these episodes with a brief biography, including the subject's date of birth. The problem is, in Lyndon's case, I have no idea. From a newspaper article dated Friday the 26th of October 2001, Lyndon is recorded as saying he was the wrong side of 50. After writing this episode, however, in a twist of fate, it just so happened that I came across Lyndon in a book I was reading. It's a very good read, and it's a book called In Search of the English Eccentric by Henry Hemmings, written back in 2008. I would thoroughly recommend it. Lyndon's date of birth is confirmed within the pages of this book as being 1944, so there we go. Lyndon was born in 1944, and that's all I can say about it. There is not much information regarding his life growing up, which is fair enough because it is his business after all. Given that Lyndon is still around today, this episode focuses heavily on the eccentric side of his life rather than his life as a whole. As mentioned, Lyndon won the title of the Greatest British Eccentric in a contest organised by Kellogg's, the cereal company, in 2001 or 2002, depending on which website you believe. Lyndon won because of his interest in creating and inventing weird and wonderful contraptions. But before we delve into these creations, let's have a look at some other competitors Lyndon had to fend off in order to be crowned champion of the eccentrics. First up is a name that was mentioned back in Series 1 of Eclectic Eccentrics, Captain Beanie. Captain Beanie, and yes, that is his real name, changed as he officially says by Beanpole, is a man who paints his face orange, dons a golden cape, pants, gloves and boots, and raises vast amounts of money for charity by taking part in various challenges. He has climbed Snowdon in Wales carrying baked beans, bathed in beans, recorded a charity Christmas song, completed the Sports Relief Mile while pushing along a tin of beans, whilst he was down on his hands and knees, and has raised over £3,500 by having 60 baked beans tattooed onto his head. He also used to run the UK's smallest political party. One of the things he was most known for was his running of a museum called the Baked Bean Museum of Excellence, which sadly closed down in 2023 after Captain Beanie moved house. Unfortunately, he was also convicted of fraudulently claiming income support back in 2005. Following a day in court, Captain Beanie explained that he'd forgotten about investments he had made, which made him eligible to claim income support, and he confirmed he'd never taken any money from the charities he fundraises for. He does have a website with more information if you'd like to find out more about this orange superhero. Just search Captain Beanie on any search engine. Also in the running for Britain's most eccentric person was a lady called Anne Atkin, who ran a gnome, as in garden gnome, reserve. A reserve which was home to over 1,500 gnomes. The gnome reserve was located at the bottom of her garden and attracted thousands of guests a year. There was a dress code for visiting guests as well, as Anne used to provide a hat and a fishing rod for guests to wear should they wish. Most of the gnomes were made by Anne, who was an artist. As well as making the gnomes and managing the reserve, Anne also founded the Gnome Club and published a newsletter 3 times a year about garden gnomes. and expressed that, in her opinion, the gnomes allowed adults to look at the world like a child again, which I think is a very good thing indeed. The Gnome Reserve remained a family-run business for 40 years. However, in 2020, the house where the reserve was based was sold and the reserve was closed. The gnomes, however, were relocated to a new location at a nearby garden centre. For more information and where to find the gnomes now, please visit www.gnomereserve.co.uk. Returning now to the eccentric competition, however, other competitors included a 61-year-old knitting fan who had an 11-mile piece of French knitting in their garden, and a man who kept over 100 pillar and letterboxes in his attic. But none, of course, could compare to Lyndon. As I said, Lyndon won the competition and became known as the most eccentric person in Britain, largely due to his wonderfully weird inventions. And this passion started early. At the age of only 12, he built a man-powered aircraft. Unfortunately, his creation fell apart as soon as he started pedaling. Despite this initial learning curve, this did not dissuade Lyndon, who went on to create many other things. Most famously perhaps are his river machines, which he proudly displays at Henley Regatta, which for non-UK listeners is a boating, rowing, festival, weekend thing for toffs and men who dress like cheap Peaky Blinders impersonators. One of Lyndon's river machines, called Tritania, is made of an electric bath chair mounted to a wooden hull. It is also equipped with a gramophone, an umbrella which rotates, a fake pigeon which flaps its wings, a bubble blower, a wine cooler, and a crank arm, built in order to send and receive drinks. Another one of Lyndon's water creations was the Voltanic, a boating machine made of fuel tanks from a fighter jet. This too was displayed at the Henley Regatta, but after being deployed onto the water, it began to sink and had to be rescued. The Voltanic is now a garden ornament. Lyndon appears to be the resident eccentric at Henley, and he has spoken about the pleasure he gets of being able to walk into VIP areas dressed in a pith helmet and goggles. Certainly gives those la-di-da toffs something to talk about, I imagine. Though not directly related, it does remind me of a little fact that back in the 18th and 19th centuries, wealthy families who owned a lot of land used to hire people to become resident hermits. They would quite literally build a cave on their ground, and the hermit would go and live in it for years at a time. This hermit would be expected to wear ragged clothes, grow out their hair, stay silent, and basically become a walking ornament. I'm not saying that Lyndon is in any way a hermit, but the upper echelons of society have always enjoyed a little bit of eccentricity in its many guises. Back to Lyndon's inventions, however. As well as water vehicles, he has also built a busking machine called the Busker-matic. It's effectively an automated orchestra that makes banging and bashing sounds. You can watch videos of it in action on YouTube. It's built of all sorts of things, including bike parts, car parts, and, well, whatever Lyndon could find in his workshop, in my opinion. Perhaps, most impressively, however, Lyndon has built himself a boat, a car, and a plane out of wicking. And why did he choose to do this? Because he saw an old picture of a wicker car and thought, why not? Which is certainly a good way to live your life. As with many eccentrics, it's not always been easy going for him though. Whilst living in an old address, Lyndon managed to obtain a couple of old gun turrets from a plane, and he then installed them on his shed roof. This naturally drew a lot of interest from locals, all positive. Or so he thought. He recounts how, one day, when he came out to his shed, he discovered that one of them had been ripped off and destroyed, likely by a neighbour who liked things being prim and proper. What a dullard. It does remind me of a quote from Julian Clary. "The English like eccentrics, they just don't like them living next door." And always remember, if you don't think you live next door to any weirdos, well, maybe you need to start looking a little bit closer to home. Once again, however, I have veered off track, so back to Lyndon, however not back to his inventions, but rather to a rather epic driving trip. It is recorded that he once drove a car he had purchased, the car did have a tree growing through it when he picked it up, from New Zealand, and he drove it all the way back to the UK, and even managed to get held up by some crooks on the way back. Now, away from his inventions and driving trips, Lyndon is, as you can imagine, a member of the Eccentric Club. I spoke in length about the Eccentric Club back in Series 1, in the same episode that I spoke about Captain Beanie, so go and check that one out. However, not only is Lyndon a member of the Eccentric Club, he is also Eccentric Club member number 1, which, given he is Britain's most eccentric man, only seems right. Now, we are almost at the end of this episode, which has been something a little bit different, as I rarely get to talk about eccentric people who are still alive, so it's been a nice change. But before I go, would you like to know what Lyndon won in the competition? Well, he took home a trophy, of course, but was also able to pick a holiday of his choosing. I believe this involved going somewhere cold and getting pulled around by some huskies. We have now reached the end of our penultimate episode for this series, which means that we are done with our eccentrics. Done, dusted, they've been put back into the history books and we must march on. As any old followers will know by now, the grand finale of any series of Eclectic Eccentrics does not look at an eccentric person, but at something else related to eccentricity. In Series 1 we looked at the Eccentric Club, in Series 2 we looked at eccentric events from around the world, and for Series 3 we are... well, you'll bloody well have to wait and find out, won't you? Until next time, I say goodbye for now.